Let's just think about this for a second. This story, it's not just some dusty piece of history. I want you to see it as a kind of blueprint, one that shows how wars are won and lost, not just on the battlefield with tanks and planes, but in, of all places, a darkened movie theater in the middle of a POW camp. And you might be asking, why does this matter to me today? Well, because it pulls back the curtain on the incredible power of the stories we all consume every single day. And it's going to force you to ask a really important question. What stories are shaping my world and me right now?
Okay, so try to put yourself in this man's shoes. You're Oberleutnant Hermann Fischer. You're a highly decorated German officer, part of Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps. For years, you've been fed a steady diet of propaganda. You've been told, and you believe, that America is this weak, decadent, crumbling society. But then, you're captured. You're in a prison camp in Texas, of all places, and they sit you down to watch a movie, Gone with the Wind. Now, what Fischer saw that night wasn't just a film, it was proof. Undeniable proof of America's real power. His reaction wasn't about the love story. It was pure, unadulterated shock at the industrial might, the artistic scale of it all. A single movie that screamed of a production capacity so huge, it just seemed impossible for a country supposedly giving its all to a world war. This was the very first crack in the armor, a powerful, psychological blow.
And that right there is the central question we're going to unpack. How on earth could a piece of fiction, just a movie, start to unravel years of carefully built ideology? How could stories about people who never even existed be more persuasive than all the lectures, all the propaganda they had ever heard? The answer, as we'll see, reveals one of the most clever and subtle psychological operations of the entire war.
Now, this whole operation didn't kick off with gentle persuasion or lectures. No, it started with a massive, undeniable shock to the system. The first phase was all about triggering overwhelming culture shock, and the weapon of choice was the sheer, jaw-dropping scale of American industry.
Just look at these numbers for a second. I mean, they're staggering. The budget for one American movie was more than the entire yearly budget for Joseph Goebbels' massive propaganda film machine. For these German officers, many of them engineers who prided themselves on German efficiency, this wasn't just an opinion they could argue with. This was cold, hard math. It was an economic reality that proved American superiority in a way they simply couldn't refute. Right there, the very foundation of what they believed started to shake.
And this ideological assault, it started before they even set foot on American soil. While they were still on the transport ships, the first film they were shown was Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. Can you just imagine the sheer confusion? You're a German soldier, you've been taught to despise Jewish people, and now you're watching a world-famous Jewish actor, an actor banned in your home country, brilliantly making a fool of your beloved Führer. One of the POWs, a sergeant, later wrote, "We didn't know whether to be offended or amazed." It was their first taste of a world where no leader, absolutely no one, was sacred or above ridicule.
And then, once they were in the camps, the next psychological bombshell dropped. They were shown Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a movie about a decent man fighting a corrupt political system, right in the heart of the American government. Now, Nazi propaganda would say, see, proof of American weakness. But, as General von Wies points out here, they saw the exact opposite. They saw a nation so confident, so fundamentally strong and secure in itself, that it could openly criticize its own flaws, and then turn around and show that criticism to its captured enemies. That was a kind of strength they had never even conceived of. It was completely alien to them.
So the US military sees this working, and what do? They don't just continue, they double down. They started deliberately picking movies that didn't just hint at America's problems, but put them right out there, front and center. This was the second phase of the operation, turning self-criticism into a weapon.
Remember, the propaganda these men knew painted America as this failed state of rich, decadent capitalists and millions of starving workers. So, the Americans showed them The Grapes of Wrath, a brutally honest film about the poverty and desperation of the Great Depression. But the film didn't show a nation on the verge of collapse. What it showed was dignity, resilience, and a society that was wrestling, honestly and openly, with its own huge failures.
And this quote, it's from exactly the kind of guy who is trained to create Nazi propaganda. And here he is, admitting that America's honesty was far more powerful than any lie his own side could come up with. The effect was immediate. After they saw films like this, the requests for American books in the camp library shot up by 400%. They didn't just want to see the movie, they wanted to read the book. They were desperate to understand where this strange, new kind of strength came from.
Let's just pause on that for a second. Just think about it. In a world where all you've known is information control and propaganda, what happens to your brain when your enemy is more honest about their own country than your leaders are about yours? It's a fundamental psychological break. It forces you to question everything, not just who is stronger, but who is actually telling the truth.
So the next stage of this psychological war was, if you can believe it, even bolder. It wasn't enough to just show American strength anymore. The new goal was to take the Nazis' own propaganda and turn it into a weapon against them. And the man in charge of this phase was none other than the legendary Hollywood director, Frank Capra. What Capra did was pure genius. You could call it ideological jujitsu, using the enemy's own power and momentum against them. His film series was called Why We Fight. And for it, he got his hands on captured German newsreels. And this included powerful, dramatic footage from Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda masterpiece, Triumph of the Will. He didn't CGI anything, he didn't fake the images. He just re-edited them, added new narration, and completely changed the context. He took their most powerful symbols of national pride and reframed them as evidence of their own aggression.
I mean, really think about what this man, Feldwebel Zimmermann, is saying. Imagine the moments that filled you with the most pride, the symbols of your nation's destiny, and then having them played back to you as proof that you're the villain. It's incredibly disorienting. For so many of these prisoners, this was the very first time they were ever forced to see their own country through the eyes of the rest of the world.
And this attack on their worldview just came from every angle imaginable. Disney movies like Fantasia completely dismantled the Nazi myth that America had no culture. Hollywood musicals showed this joyful, energetic, and surprisingly integrated society that flew in the face of their racial ideology. Westerns were all about the lone hero, the individual standing up against injustice, the total opposite of the Nazi focus on the state. And then you had stars like Katharine Hepburn playing these strong, independent women, a vision of gender equality that was absolutely revolutionary to them. Every single movie was like another chisel, just chipping away at the wall of their beliefs. But as the war in Europe ground to its brutal end in 1945, the film program took its final and its darkest turn. The goal wasn't to persuade anymore. It wasn't to impress. It was to force a final, horrifying reckoning with the true consequences of their ideology.
As Allied soldiers were liberating the concentration camps, Signal Corps cameramen were right there with them, documenting everything they found. That raw, uncensored, horrifying footage was rushed back to the United States and became required viewing in every single POW camp. Eyewitnesses said that the movie theaters, once filled with chatter and arguments, fell into this dead, awful silence, broken only by the sound of grown men sobbing.
Words really can't describe the impact of those films, but maybe this number can. At just one camp, Camp Butner, after one of these screenings, 1,000 German prisoners walked out of the theater, built a massive bonfire, and one by one threw their German uniforms into the flames. This wasn't just a gesture. It was a complete and total rejection of who they were. It was a profound public act of shame. For these men, the war inside their own heads was finally, truly over.
So what was the result? After all this unprecedented experiment in changing minds, what was the lasting impact? Well, it didn't end when the fighting stopped. In fact, you could argue that's when the most important part of the story really began.
The results were just incredible. A huge survey of 22,000 of these returning prisoners found that almost 3/4 of them, 74%, left America with a positive view of democracy. Only a tiny, hardened core of 10% still clung to their Nazi beliefs. Hollywood's dream factory had done what bombs and bullets alone never could. It had actually changed their minds.
And these men didn't just go home and disappear, they became the architects of the new democratic Germany. They founded influential newspapers like Der Ruf, which means the call. They started literary movements like Group 47, which would define German culture for a generation. They went on to become leaders in politics and business, helping to build the West German economic miracle. The strong alliance that exists between the US and Germany today, some of its deepest roots were planted right there in those makeshift camp movie theaters.
Decades later, at a camp reunion, a former German captain, Wilhelm Richter, summed it all up perfectly. He said Hollywood showed them what was possible. Not a perfect country, but a resilient one. And the lesson they learned was that true strength didn't come from conformity, but from diversity. That real prosperity wasn't born from conquest, but from freedom.
You know, this whole story is just such a powerful reminder that the things we watch, the narratives we consume, they're never just entertainment. They carry our values, they shape our fears, they build our dreams. They are constantly shaping how we see the world, how we see each other, and how we see ourselves. And so that brings us right back to that critical question for all of us. Today, what are the stories, the movies, the shows, the feeds that are shaping your world right now? And what ideas are they planting in your mind?